Welcome to my podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? With my guests, we are exploring health issues and questions you may have about your health. And today it's a real privilege to be discussing with Dr. Tessa Copp. Is women's health tech empowerment or exploitation? Now, Tessa is a postdoctoral research fellow in the University of Sydney School of Public Health. Her research focuses on the psychosocial impacts of disease labels, overdiagnosis, and evidence-based reproductive healthcare for women. Her PhD research examined the benefits and harms of a polycystic ovary syndrome diagnosis and has been published in high-impact journals in the field. Welcome, Tessa.
Thanks so much, Joyce. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here and discussing this with you.
Now, this is a hot topic and we're going to get into some controversial discussions. But before we do that, I would love to hear from you, Tessa, about what made you decide to be a scientist and work in this particular field.
Thanks, Joyce. I guess I was very lucky to hit the jackpot with my supervisors during my psychology honours year. So Jesse Janssen and Kirsten McCaffrey. They were actually based in the School of Public Health and introduced me to the fascinating and controversial field of overdiagnosis and low-value care. And I made the connection with polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS, as all of a sudden lots of people I knew around my age were being diagnosed. So I started digging into the literature and how the diagnostic criteria had been expanded. And with the help of many experts in overdiagnosis and PCOS, I turned it into a PhD, which was an amazing experience. And since then, I've been kind of examining inappropriate medicalization of women's reproductive health in other areas.
Yes, and you've got lots to research on because it's something that I've been delving into as well. Now, before we get into some of the nitty gritty, let's have some definitions. How would you define women's health tech? What does it mean? It's sometimes called femtech. What does it mean?
Yeah, so I guess I see it as digital health products or health technology that's focusing on women's health, whether that be to monitor and track signs or symptoms, measure signs, or some even claim to provide solutions in certain areas of women's health, whether that be fertility, pregnancy, menstrual cycles, sexual wellness. It's really has expanded under this banner of femtech to many different areas, and it comes in the form of apps, sensors, online questionnaires, or monitors.
And it is a very large growing area. And I assume that health tech companies have two aims. And I hope that their number one aim is to improve health. But obviously they are a company, they are in the corporate world. So their aim is to also make money. And what do you think about that? Is that a problem, trying to juggle those two?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think, most, do have the best of intentions. They are aiming to improve women's health, and some definitely are targeting, really important unmet needs or, areas that desperately need more attention and care for women. But with these competing interests, different conflicts of interest that come into play can set certain agendas and cloud judgments. So, perhaps pressure from shareholders to make a profit, that pressure can be greater or overshadow the need to pay close attention to the evidence. And, even though I feel like most probably arise originally from good intentions, it seems like some almost seem to purposefully conceal the evidence to spin their product in the name of profit. So, for example, with the anti-Müllerian hormone or AMH tests, there's very clear evidence, and has been for several years now, that it's not predictive of fertility, yet, there's many companies out there selling the test explicitly claiming it can predict a woman's chances of conceiving. So
Yeah, we're gonna delve into AMH testing in a lot more detail. But before we do that, if a health tech company came to you and said we want to develop a test for something, and say if you agreed with it, what advice would you give to them and expect them from their development of their new tech? I'm at an event next week about women's health tech, and I'm on a panel with a company that I do some work with called Geddy and Richter, and we're talking about how pharma and startups in women's health tech could work together. And my advice would be that academia needs to be in there as well, because we're not out to make money and we are there for evidence-based medicine. But what advice would you give to a new health tech company?
yeah, well, that's exactly it, Joyce. So I think ideally they'd want to involve, multiple stakeholders with as little bias or vested interest as possible to try and reduce the conflicts of interest that jeopardize the interpretation of the evidence, or, hijack the agenda away from helping women in favor of making money. So there's that, but also I don't think it's too big of an ask to have solid, defensible evidence of benefit behind the claims they make. Expert opinion anecdotes, they're just not good enough. So yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna delve into that a bit more. What let's talk about what is evidence-based medicine. So I wrote quite a lot about this in my book Your Fertile Years, because when I wrote that book, I generally I seem to be spending a lot of time debunking myths that people take on board. And you and I have done a lot of
Mm.
studying to understand evidence-based medicine and understand what a clinical trial is and what a randomized control trial is. But I totally understand that journalists and the public do not understand what that means. And so their interpretation of some of the published work that we get, unfortunately, in the literature, in the scientific literature, might not be good science, might be bad science. So what would what do you consider evidence-based medicine? If you were a company and you said a product was going to come onto the market, what would you like to see that company do? You talked about anecdotal evidence, and we'll talk about marketing towards the end, but I see so many companies that on their website, it's just full of testimonials from women saying, yes, I love this. It was
Mm.
wonderful. That's, we know that's not evidence-based medicine. Tell us about evidence-based medicine.
Yeah, it's exactly that, and I think there's so many people, who aren't really aware of the weighting that should be applied to certain, study designs and types, and often people think expert opinion is the gold standard when really, actually, it's at the bottom. um, and so I think ideally, we want to see, randomized clinical trials examining this before products are implemented into practice. But if that's not possible, then there needs to be transparency, first and foremost, about the lack of evidence here, or the potential limitations. But really, I think, to me, it doesn't seem too big of an ask to wait for the evidence before rolling out, because there's a strong risk that there could be substantial harm. You might assume that there's going to be benefit. There might be no benefit, but there might actually be real harm that can result. And so I think that was one of kind of the arguments that we grappled with when writing our piece that we'll probably discuss further down, is that women's health, it is so underfunded and under-researched, and there's so many knowledge gaps, and there's such a big need for intervention and need for knowledge, that why don't we just implement these things so that women can keep up at the same pace as men. But there's a huge risk that you could actually be further disadvantaging women. Often an assumption that benefit doesn't necessarily play out in the evidence. sorry, that's a bit of a roundabout way of answering. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
Yeah, no, that's great. So just for our listeners, I have written about this in my book, but if you don't know what a randomized controlled trial is, this is where you would normally have two groups that are randomized, and you'd have one group, say, for example, if there was a treatment that you would do, you would have one group that would be randomized into the group that would have the treatment, and the other people would be randomized into the group that don't have the treatment, and you would decide what you were trying to look for. So, for example, in fertility treatment, we're going to talk later about IVF add-ons, which I spend a lot of my time talking about. These are a whole suite of treatments that the clinics will say will improve your chance of having a baby. We're not getting pregnant, having a baby. So the endpoint of the study would be having a baby, if the what we call the live birth rate, and the two groups would be one having the add-on and one group not having the add-on. And at the end of the study, and we need hundreds of people ideally in this study, you would have a look and see if the delivery rate was different between the two groups, and that's a standard delivery of a randomized controlled trial. Sorry. I wanted to take that up about companies running with tech and then being biased about it before they really have developed it. And I was at a health check event this week, and someone said, well, with companies, what they often do is fake it till you make it. And apparently that's quite a well-known term in Silicon Valley, which I found a bit worrying. Fake it till you make it. And so basically, if you've got an idea and it's not quite working yet, just, you want to be out there, you want to be the first. So get out there and do it. And it does remind me of Elizabeth Holmes. And I've been really criticized for talking about Elizabeth Holmes, but she was the founder of Theranos, and they had a great idea. She had a great idea, and she's very bright, very dynamic. And her idea was to have a blood testing machine that you just do on a finger prick test. And she wanted people to have easy access to a whole range of tests that could improve their health and make an early diagnosis of various disorders. So as we said earlier, she's got a great idea. She really did want to save the world, but you need to make sure that this actually is deliverable. And it didn't work. It wasn't possible to do. It wasn't possible to do some of these tests even on a large amount of blood, never mind about a finger prick. But she was very convincing, and I think she, you mentioned the term hijacked. I think she got hijacked along the way, and it just seemed to have got all out of control. And there's a great drama at the moment on TV about what happened for Elizabeth Holmes. It was really captivating, and there was a big culture of secrecy and suing. And obviously she got millions and I think she got billions actually in funding for something that didn't work. But now she's in prison for fraud. And she's not the only company. She's the only one I know is in prison. Actually, I know a couple of people in prison, not personally. But I am aware of other companies. There was a company in the fertility field called Molecular Biometrics years ago that said that they could help predict the best embryo to transfer in fertility treatment. And again, they were running before they could walk. And I had many discussions with this company. It was set up by someone I know very well. It didn't work. The tech, I kept saying to them, your tech doesn't work. And then finally the company went under. So what's your view on fake it till you make it?
Yeah, I think, this is such a big issue and just so dangerous in the health space, in particular. And I still find it unbelievable that medical interventions and tests can be, rolled out and put into practice before they're backed by evidence. And I do really worry about companies concealing results that will hurt their profit margins behind the scenes. And you wonder how often it's happening. But I also think, it's not just industry that, probably do this. I think scientists aren't immune to this. And there's other conflicts of interest aside from financial at play, like, professional or personal And, reporting a negative result is never fun, especially when you've spent, years working on something and there's, been so much funding and energy put into something. But, a negative finding is still really important and it should still be applauded, no matter how disappointing it. It reminds me of the big, cervical cancer screening trial that's just finished. And, they found that, after 20, 30 years or however long it was, it didn't actually prevent more death. And it was so disappointing. But, they were so honest about it. And it was, I think we should, really applaud those efforts still, just because, it was still so important to know that, there isn't a screening program yet that can help in this instance. Still vital knowledge. So.
Yeah, I do think along the way, scientists, including some academics I've heard of, that have just got out of their depth. And I think that I wonder whether they, they wish they could turn the clock back. Do you think we can regulate this in any way? Is there any regulation that we could do? I mean, there should be, but it doesn't seem to be that this new tech is being regulated at all.
No, yeah, I think even, in countries where there is regulation, it seems to barely scratch the surface. So, for instance, in Australia, we've got the TGA. I think they're concerned about, I'm using the example of the AMH test here. They're concerned whether the AMH test measures what it claims to measure, which is the anti-Müllerian hormone. And it does, okay, tick, that's all they're concerned about. It's not necessary, they don't look at the greater context in which it's being recommended or the recommendations of actions based off the test result. So it really falls short, I think, in that regard. Yes, so I think there's also the issue that it's very reactive. It's dependent on clinicians or the public making a complaint about a company and then it's investigated. So I think there's a lot of things that probably slip through the gaps. So definitely, it's just misses the mark, I think, most of the time, and we definitely need better regulation in this regard.
And the regulation does sometimes say, so it will license a test. So people see, oh, it's a licensed test. So like the AMH testing, it can get licensed. So yes, the regulators check that the company can do the test and it's doing what it says. But that doesn't mean the test is going to achieve anything. So I think that's a big problem for the public. They see a licensed test. It's got, all the right markings on it, the FDA approval, etc. But it just means that the company are doing that test. If that test has any use for the public to take is a totally another question, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're exactly right. And, where it might be useful in some circumstances doesn't mean it's going to be useful in others. So it's kind of extrapolated out to lots of different situations or kind of advertised to way more people than would actually benefit. You're right.
So do you think if we have bad women's health tech, it can actually be dangerous to a woman's health, or is it just dangerous to her finances? So she might be paying for a test that's not valid, but do we need to worry? Could any of the data or the results that she gets actually be bad for her?
Yeah, absolutely. It can be, I think, so dangerous, especially in the form of, over testing, misdiagnosis, overdiagnosis, and over treatment. So medical interventions aren't without harm. And if they aren't warranted in the first place, the harms can be significant. And I think, people often don't see the link between what can seem like a harmless test. It's only $100. It's just a test, to the potential downstream consequences. So, for example, getting an AMH test under the false premise that it can predict your chance of conceiving. This can lead to false reassurance about delaying pregnancy. If you get a good result, then really age is the most important factor. or unwarranted anxiety, which can, place a lot of pressure to conceive earlier than wanted, or, pressure women to undergo costly and unneeded fertility procedures, which can have substantial side effects as well as the significant financial cost.
Yeah, you've really summarised it there about the AMH testing. I think there are going to be, I mean, everything I've sorry, everything I've listened to about the test is, so I'm just going to cough it. It's very early in the morning here for me. I'm not quite awake yet. So the AMH testing, as you said, it's supposed to be. It says on the tin that it will predict your fertility, but it doesn't. As you've said, it doesn't do that. So I'm really worried about those women who, if the result says your fertility's okay, and you might be 31 or 32, and it's telling your fertility okay, you might delay, as you said, delay your fertility, and then I think they're going to be women who then totally miss the boat on having children because they've got this result from this AMH test and they think they're okay. And then, as you said, there's women having costly egg freezing procedures. So I think that's very, very dangerous to women. And I also think we end up with what we call a worried well. And you've talked about the anxiety, which I just think that is unacceptable. It is dangerous. And yeah, people have to be very, very careful. And a major concern I have is that these health tech companies are trying to replace a visit to the doctor. That I see more and more now offering a suite of tests, and I'm really worried about the advice that they give. They're often not a doctor, and again talking about this worried well. And for years, and I do it as well. If we're feeling unwell, we go and Google something and we listen to Dr. Google. But then what we normally do is go to see our doctor and say, okay, I've Googled it. I think I've got this or that. And then the right tests and treatment are going to be done. But now we've got this other layer of health tech where people are then deciding they're not going to see the doctor, and then they're deciding what tests they're going to have with the company. And I just think that this is getting more and more confused and more dangerous. So what's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's such an issue. And, I'm coming back to the AMH test again because it's where most of my research is focused on. But, online companies, some of them offer a doctor consult after giving the test results, saying, we're providing adequate counselling and, they're seeing a qualified doctor. But I think that's too late after you've gotten the test results because counselling about the test limitations and reasons for getting it should come before the test is ordered. Once you get that result and experience the emotional reaction to it, you can't undo that. You can't unknow the result, and I think people really underestimate the impact it can have on people. Diagnostic labels can really change the way people think about themselves. It impacts self-esteem. It changes their behavior. There's numerous studies looking at the impact of a diagnosis of hypertension on number of sick days. It can really change the way people live their lives. And so they really, we shouldn't be bandied them around lightly.
Many years ago, I did the 23andMe test. And I can't remember how many years ago it is now, but I chronicled it on BBC Radio. So I was telling everyone I was doing the test, and then they came round one Sunday evening and recorded me opening the test. So you open this test on your own, you just open an email, and there's your data. And there was no doctor. That, as you said, it could have been very stressful. And there were some things on there that I didn't agree with. It said I was lactose intolerant. I don't think I am. But there were also tests on there. There was tests on there for Alzheimer's, breast cancer, and I literally spent about 3 days before I got the results, really delving deeply into what they said they were offering, and a lot of the specific tests they were doing, the mutations they were looking at were for Ashkenazi Jewish population, not for someone of my genetic background. So the tests were they were problematic. But I had blocked the Alzheimer's. I have Alzheimer's in my family, and I don't want to know if I'm going to get it because no treatment. But to unlock it, as far as I was aware, was just 2 clicks. You clicked on it and you said, "Are you sure you want to unlock it?" And then you clicked again and it unlocked it. So imagine on a Sunday evening with the BBC Radio, interviewer in my house, opening that and then finding out I had a risk of breast cancer or Alzheimer's. That is just unacceptable. We've got to understand that there are people at the end of this, for sure.
Absolutely. Well said.
So let's go into your terrific paper. I was so pleased when I saw this paper, and lots of people sent it to me and said, "You're going to love this paper." Now it's titled "Marketing Empowerment: How Corporations Co-opt Feminist Narratives to Promote Non-Evidence-Based Health Interventions." And I'll put a link to this. It is behind a paywall, unfortunately, but you can read the beginning of it. But we're going to talk about it now. So I want to ask you many questions about the paper, but tell us overall, what were your key messages of why you wanted to write this and what did you find in the paper?
Yeah, so this paper really focuses on how language around increased knowledge and women's empowerment and enhancing autonomy, this language is being used by commercial entities to market new technologies, tests and treatments that are not backed by robust evidence. And so it was just something that me and my colleagues had kind of noticed, this rhetoric often being used to kind of sell products and kind of using the guise or, portraying themselves as socially progressive. And, it's by women, for women, and, knowledge is power, and empower yourself with information to make informed decisions about your reproductive health. And it's so persuasive, and, it really makes you feel like you've got to act, you've got to do something. Except, the products they're selling don't have evidence of benefit, or they've got, good evidence that they don't work. And, this marketing, I think it's so persuasive, and it really risks harming women, through inappropriate medicalization and overdiagnosis and overtreatment. And, often, these health technologies, tests and treatments, we're not arguing against the use of them per se, because they are beneficial to some women in certain situations. But it's about the way that the commercial marketing and efforts push these interventions to a much larger group of women who are likely to benefit without being explicit about their limitations. So we kind of looked at, it's not just companies and industry, but also mass media and even well-intentioned advocacy groups using these kind of simplistic phrasing to push these products that, just don't have any evidence of benefit. So kind of goes against the empowerment being sought.
And as you said, the AMH test is useful for some women, but for those it's useful for and needed for, they can go to their doctor, certainly I think in Australia as well, and certainly in the UK, they can go to their doctor and get that test for free rather than, and get proper advice, rather than pay a company to do a test and then go through this very odd system of medical advice. So, that seems absolutely crazy to do this online when you can go to your doctor.
Yeah. So I think the AMH test does have a small cost. Sometimes it depends what state you're in, but it's a lot cheaper, I think, to get it from your doctor than through an online company. And yeah, it's certainly useful in particular situations, mainly in assisted reproduction. So if you've decided to undergo fertility treatment, it can So basically the AMH test, it's associated with the number of eggs in the ovaries. So it roughly indicates the number of eggs that might be retrieved in a stimulated cycle when undergoing IVF or egg freezing. So it's certainly not perfect. You can still get a number that you don't expect, but it might help in setting expectations about how many cycles you might need and the cost and the subsequent cost of that to get a good enough number of eggs to freeze or, to understand your chances in terms of IVF.
Yeah. if you were a 25-year-old woman who were not thinking of getting pregnant for many years, is there any use of you having an AMH test?
No. Stay away from the AMH test. I think it's not useful at all in that situation because it's not predictive of current or future fertility. Unfortunately, there is no magic or a reliable test of fertility except for trying to get pregnant. So don't get it. Save yourself the money and angst.
Yeah. And it's and as I said earlier, I'm more worried about the 30-year-old who gets it and they're told one of two things. They're told, oh, your fertility's fine, so they might delay trying to get pregnant, or your fertility's not fine, we think you should freeze your eggs. And as we've both said earlier, we think that's both of those are dangerous. So it would worry me more about that. And also when I was wrote this section in my book, I was really careful. I sent it to lots of clinicians to make sure I got the wording right and that I wasn't just being unconsciously biased against this test. I just wanted to be sure, and I was careful of the wording. But also fertility is not just about one person, it's about your partner as well. So just looking at your fertility inside, even if there was a test that could do that, it's your partner's fertility as well. And the two of you together, you could be super fertile with one person and not with another for various reasons we won't go into. Why do you think companies and fertility clinics, we must say it's not just online companies, also fertility clinics, market this as a valid test? And I've heard so many women say, oh, I've got to get the fertility test. They also say we've got to get the menopause test, and there's no menopause test. But they have become obsessed with wanting these tests. And I think you said before we started, did you say there was 27 companies that you found that were offering AMH testing? Why would they want to do this?
Yeah, so I think for the fertility clinics, I think, years ago when the test first came out, it looked like a really promising marker of fertility. It was relatively stable across the menstrual cycle, and I think it was very quickly adopted into practice in fertility clinics and has kind of now become a routine test in the workup to IVF. And since then, the evidence has emerged that really questions its usefulness aside from helping to set expectations about egg retrieval numbers. So it's like once something is implemented, it's so hard to de-implement. And, I wonder, we did a kind of analysis of the information on fertility clinic websites here in Australia. And, we found that there was a lot of kind of misleading and inaccurate information, and it made me question how often these clinics are updating the information on their websites because science is constantly evolving. Information goes out of date so quickly. And so, the doctors might have been saying up-to-date evidence, but their websites certainly weren't. But, the online companies, however, so you mentioned the 27 companies we found. So this is companies selling the test direct to consumers. So they had an add to cart option where you could automatically buy the test. They're much more recent, and it's hard for me to see how they've missed the strong recommendations in the guidelines not to use this test outside of fertility treatment settings. So for me, that kind of seems more of a blatant disregard of the evidence in the name of profit. So
Yeah, which
I don't know.
is very sad. Right, we're going to move slightly away from AMH testing. We don't want to just talk about AMH testing. And oh, actually, the last thing
Yeah.
to say, AMH testing, as you said, looks at the quantity of your eggs, but what's really important about your egg as well is the quality of your egg, and it tells you nothing about the quality of your egg. But in your paper, you
Yeah.
mentioned the book Feminists Forever, and it did make me smile and chuckle. It's a book we've talked about a lot. In the UK, there's maybe we're risking getting sued on this one. I don't know, but there's someone that promotes this book and says it's a great book for women's health. And there's many of us who criticize the book and use it as an example of not being empowerment for women. I know the problem with this book. Can you tell us what's the problem with the author of this book?
Yeah, so I think, I'm in no way an expert in menopause, but we wanted to show how the hijacking of feminism has been happening for many years, long before femtech was a thing. And so this book was written by a gynecologist who argued that menopause is an estrogen deficiency disease that needed to be treated, and hormone replacement therapy was a cure for women to maintain their femininity and attractiveness. And they really pushed this narrative that HRT was key to women's liberation, through enabling greater control over their bodies. And I think what wasn't widely known at the time was that he was funded by the HRT industry. So, but you probably know a lot more about that book than I do.
No, well, to be honest, I haven't read the whole thing. I don't think I try not to do things now that upset me. I get upset, but there are still people today. So I think we should bring this in. There are really still reputable scientists, and I've mentioned I do some work with some companies. I always declare it. I whenever I give a talk, I have a slide with all the companies listed that have ever paid me for consultations. I think it's important as an academic to try and help companies who are trying to develop new technology. And I get messages every week from someone with new tech saying, "Could you be involved?" Which I think is really good. But we need to declare it if we are taking a commission or getting a conference trip or whatever from a company, then we need to make that clear so that people are aware of that. And I don't think that happens. And let's move on to period tracker apps. Also something that we've mirrored our research a lot. I've also looked at fertility clinic websites as well and how they mismarket things. But let's look at, you've mentioned in your paper period tracker apps. And my main issue with these, I think they're great. If I had periods, I would use one. But our research shows that so many of them that just look at dates. They don't measure anything, any what we call markers of ovulation, such as luteinizing hormone, which is rises just before you ovulate. So many of them tell women the day of ovulation. So they're just looking at period dates. You just put in the date of your period, and then what will happen? It will tell you normally in 14 days or 13 days for some of them. It will say you are ovulating, and I think this is really inaccurate and dangerous use of health tech, because I think I've been told that there have been pregnancies where women who are trying not to get pregnant, the app told them they'd ovulated, so they thought that they were now not at risk of getting pregnant and had unprotected sex. And I also know people who are trying to get pregnant and are using these apps. And our research into this with one of the companies, I've fully disclosed, I work with Natural Cycles, who do measure a marker of ovulation. They measure your change in your body temperature. And we found, and other studies since looking at big data have found that ovulation is not on day 14. It can really vary between different women. And on average, it's nearer to day 16. So tell us more about your thoughts about these period tracker apps.
Yeah, no, that's really great to hear. And I think probably one positive that's coming out of them is that we're now finally getting population level data on what a regular menstrual cycle even is, because we don't have that data. And I think, you said what you've said absolutely is, they can be incredibly inaccurate, and I think depending on how heavily their predictions are believed, that can have such serious consequences. And they do include the caveats and the limitations in small print, but that's not what you see when you see the big circle saying ovulation day 3, or you're going to ovulate in 3 days. There's none of that caveats in there. And I think I must admit, I have a period tracker app and I love it. But I think there are some good benefits that are coming through them. So I think they do a really good job of normalizing things like discharge. Being a teenager girl and being really stressed and anxious about whether this is normal. I think there are positives in addition to having better data. So it's great that you're partnering with them to do stuff like this. But alongside the issues you've mentioned, aside from them being grossly inaccurate, some of them have also introduced what they're calling pre-diagnostic tools, where they if your cycle isn't deemed regular, despite the fact that we don't really know what regular even is, they'll say, you might have PCOS, do this questionnaire, and then based off that result, they give you a diagnosis, which they're, saying is a pre-diagnosis. There's caveats saying, this isn't a diagnostic tool, but they're basically labeling women with PCOS based off, nothing really. And there's such serious harms that can result from this. My PhD looked into the benefits and harms of receiving a diagnosis of PCOS, and it it really doesn't take much for women to doubt their fertility, and it can have serious, psychological, emotional, and behavioural consequences.
It's really, I find it really, really frustrating, and I don't understand. So to me, there's a lot of bad science out there. I'll bring this up now. I also know that there is a culture of threatening to sue people. I've been threatened to be sued. Maybe we'll be threatened to be sued after this. And some of these companies have a lot of money, and they threaten to sue a scientist who has no means of dealing with this, and they cause us lots of stress doing that. And I just don't understand why we've got this bad culture of bad science happening by people who are really reputable, and really many of them who I have admired in the past, and then they've sort of, I'll use your term again, hijacked along the way. And another example of this is the IVF add-ons. So I've mentioned this many times before, but so fertility treatment is big business. It's a multi-billion-dollar business. In most countries, we charge patients crazy amounts to try and help them have a baby. And there's a lot of IVF millionaires. I always joke about the clinicians all driving around in their Maseratis, and some of them have Maseratis. And they're making money off people and the vulnerable public who are trying to get pregnant. And I've done a lot of work on IVF add-ons, which is treatments that are claiming to help your chance of having a baby, as I said earlier. And with the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, I was part of the group that developed a traffic light system to help people understand the complexities of these treatments, because you would think and I know it's a big problem in Australia as well, and you think with our regulating boards that because it's regulated, these are fertility treatments very regulated in our countries, you would think that the regulators could say you can't do treatments that are not evidence-based. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And the HFEA has even given some of these treatments a red signal saying, these are not evidence-based, et cetera, et cetera. You'd think they could just say, well, the clinics can't do it anymore, but they don't. They don't say that. And we wrote a paper last year with a big European group that I work with, ESHRA, giving some recommendations about this. But I just that these treatments are still there, they're still being offered, and what worries me is that we publish our papers and tell people. I know you've got a paper coming out about giving women information about AMH before they consider the test, and the results were good, that they that there was useful information there, but people still ignore the guidance from the main societies. For example, in the UK, the British Menopause Society make clear statements about use of HRT, etc., but it gets ignored because I think social media and the propaganda and the great slick marketing of some of these companies just overshadows reasoning, and also the promotion by celebrities. Here it's celebrities promote lots of these things. Another controversial area is glucose monitoring, which I won't go to. I'm sure I'll get sued.
Yeah.
But the celebrities are out there, and so the public get bombarded with this amazing marketing, and it's just a mess out there. What do you think? Is there a solution? How can we help the public get through this mud?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, you're exactly right. Everything you said, I'd echo strongly, and it's such a mess, and I don't have a solution. But I think it's not fair to place the responsibility on women to navigate these health messages and understand all the potential benefits and harms in order to make an informed decision. And the responsibility has to be placed on the companies that are marketing these health interventions. But as you say, there's, even with regulations and guidance and guidelines and, that awesome traffic light system, it's still happening. And I feel like, the government has a responsibility to do more, I think, and counter commercially driven messages and more strongly regulate the marketing of unproven health interventions. The current regulations are just not working.
Yeah, and my last podcast was with Dame Leslie Regan, our Women's Health Ambassador, and she made a program in 2009 called Professor Regan Investigates, and she was looking at how some companies were using science to sell. And I've seen on some of these companies, actually many of the companies, they say backed by science. And I think we're in a much worse position than we were in 2009 when Leslie did her program. And going back to the IVF add-ons, that the HFEA govern fertility treatment in the UK, but they have a limited power. And they actually have been sued before by a number of clinics, and the clinics always win because the clinics have they've got lots of money. They have a much better lawyer, and they had to bring in the Competitions Marketing Authority to try and help with the bad marketing, as you said earlier, such as fertility clinic websites, etc. But the authority the marketing authority made a great report, and it was really robust, and they said they were going to sue clinics if they made misinformation on their website. But nothing happened. It's still there. So what do we do?
It's so depressing.
Yeah, it's right. Then in the last question about your paper, you've said, isn't more information and knowledge always power? So I want to finish on that note. It's not always power, is it? What can we do about that?
No. Yeah, and we're not arguing that women shouldn't be informed. We want to support stronger women's autonomy about their bodies and health decisions, but I guess we're wanting kind of more awareness about the issues with this simplistic phrases and sayings, and it's the way they're kind of used to downplay or conceal the limitations or exaggerate the benefits and downplay the harms. So, it's the marketing and campaigning for interventions and provision of information without stating the limitations or unclear evidence of benefit that really risk causing more harm than good. The positive spin and emphasis on the benefits without discussing the harms, it's the opposite of empowering. It's disempowering. So I think just being more wary of simplistic messaging in such slick marketing, because there's always more to the story.
So if there's any health tech companies out there that want to sue Tessa or I, I have to say, please don't sue us. It's freedom of speech. We are giving our personal views on this. So I'm making that caveat now. It's our personal views, and we should be able to have freedom of speech, hopefully. And Tessa, my last questions I ask all of my guests. This podcast is called "Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This?" Have there been questions that you've come across where people have said to you, especially women, have said to you, I didn't know this. Why didn't anyone tell me this before? And if so, what is the main question they've said?
That's a great question. I guess something that I found really fascinating when I first got into this field was I didn't realize that medicine wasn't black and white, and I didn't realize that disease definitions were, based off pathological findings. They're often, just a group of experts who come together and decide what the definition should be, and that, science and medicine is grey, and it's a continuum of, severity, and it's so arbitrary where the line is drawn between normal and abnormal. So I guess, knowing that it's not black and white, and kind of looking at the rationale and reasoning behind certain decisions before kind of blatantly accepting a diagnosis or a recommendation. But yeah, in terms of the AMH, I guess, I think there needs to be a lot more awareness and education around, simple things about fertility. In high school, often all we're taught is how not to get pregnant, and I think that's obviously so important because you are so fertile when you're a teenager. But knowing that it's actually not always all that simple, and more awareness about the impact of age on fertility without being alarmist, because obviously it's often, it's not often a choice when to have children. There's a lot of societal factors at play. I think probably those two things.
That's a great place for me to comment that the work we're doing, we set up an international reproductive health education collaboration where I've got together some of the world experts who have been teaching and doing research on education. And we have the great team in Australia. You've had a website, a government-led, I believe, website, Karen Hammerberg and others have been working on giving free advice about fertility to the public. And the international group, we work with ESHRA, who I mentioned before, and we want to give people empowerment through education. So that's where we think empowerment comes. We want to make sure that everybody, right from school, is informed, not, as you said, not just how not to get pregnant, but how to get pregnant, how to have a healthy pregnancy. We feel if we educate about the limitations of apps and tech and testing and AMH testing and menopause testing and all these other things, if we educate the public, then they can make an informed decision. But we are at battle with social media, which, as I said, shouts very loudly. And when you've got a professor or a society telling you one thing, but then you've got a celebrity who you really admire telling you something different, and you get bombarded on social media, unfortunately, that's now it's a battle that we have to try and get things back to a evidence-based level. So we'll keep working on that. And the last few questions, What
Yeah.
makes you happy, and where is your happy place?
So these days it's probably hanging out with my little 8-month-old boy Jasper. But I also love cycling with my girl gang and playing soccer. And my happy place has got to be camping on the north coast of New South Wales, a little place called Red Rock. If you ever come to Australia, I'd recommend it. It's a beautiful place in the world.
Brilliant. And I'm so glad I've asked all my podcast guests this, because now this is my next book. I'm doing a big study with 50 women, all over 50. I know you're a long way away from that. And where it's all about good health and happiness. And I think it's so inspiring to hear different people's views on what makes them happy, and their happy place. So thank you for sharing that, and congratulations on your little boy. They grow very quickly.
Oh, thank you.
um,
Yeah, I've seen that already.
the very last question: what advice would you give your younger self?
That's a great question. I guess it would be probably not stressing. Don't stress about not knowing what career you want or where you want to be in 10 years. Just take each opportunity as it comes and follow your interests and hunches as pop up, and trust that they'll lead somewhere interesting, as they almost always have. So,
That's
yeah.
that's that's great. And so many people I've asked that question to have said, don't stress. And then we've talked today about tests that can make you more stressed.
Yeah.
So that's come round lovely.
Oh,
Tessa, thank you so much. It's been very early for me, very late for you with our time difference. Thank you for your brilliant work, and please keep it up. We've got an ongoing, growing problem. So I think your work's really essential. And so many people, when I told them I was interviewing you, said, brilliant, brilliant. And thank you very much for your time, Tessa.
oh, thanks so much, Joyce. It's been awesome to chat to you. Thank you.
Thank you.